Tonight, the issue so divisive it sparked violent clashes thousands of miles from the battlefield. From the east to the west coast, on America's campuses, thousands are expressing anger over their country's stance on the Middle East.
I can't quite believe what I'm seeing, but this line of California highway police officers who were marching through this area have been brought to a standstill by this young woman who, at intervals, sinks to her knees and begins to pray.
As the US Secretary of State makes his 7th trip to the region, we'll ask why Gaza is taking center stage in American politics. And why demonstrations in the region itself are being quickly stifled. I'll hear live from a protester who was detained in Egypt for speaking out. Plus, we'll hear more about another crackdown, this time in Georgia, where authorities used water cannon and tear gas against crowds. And what is the deal with Ozempic? We explore whether all the celebrity hype should be taken with a dose of caution. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. We begin with the images that have exposed the deep divisions across the United States. Pro-Palestinian protesters and counter-demonstrators facing off on a university campus, trading words and blows as police try to keep them apart. The tension has been simmering for weeks. But why has the situation in Gaza provoked such a violent response from those so far removed from the real action? And contrast that anger with this more subdued visit to the Israeli border. America's top diplomat was today told by Israel's Prime Minister that there can be no deal with Hamas, which involves ending the war. Tonight, we'll ask whether the failure of diplomacy and the unrest it sparked could lead to change in leadership as the US heads to the polls later this year. And we'll ask why similar protests in Arab states are being stamped out. All that in a moment. But first, we'll hear from our correspondents on the east and the west of the United States. Let's get started in California, where Martha Kellner was on the scene at UCLA as tensions boiled over.
Fireworks, fury, and fear. These are the biggest protests at American universities for half a century. And this week, they've got much bigger and much more violent.
Where are the cops? Should we just put it down? Should we call 911?
Exactly, that's what I've been saying.
Where are the cops?
It was the question on everyone's lips. Brawls continuing for hours before any police turned up.
Water.
Attackers with makeshift weapons trying to break into a pro-Palestinian tent encampment. This protester pounced on by a large group.
Stop!
Students left bloodied and beaten. Tear gas and pepper spray were fired into the air. When the police did finally arrive, they tried to control the chaos. Piercing the noise was a quiet act of defiance. Police uncertain how to respond to this. I can't quite believe what I'm seeing, but this line of California highway police officers who were marching through this area have been brought to a standstill by this young woman who, at intervals, sinks to her knees and begins to pray. They've clearly decided that they're not going to intervene, that they're going to allow her to continue with this prayer ritual. A night watchman guarded the encampment as police pushed forward. From east to west, this is now a country divided. You're wearing a mask. Why are you wearing a mask?
Why am I wearing a mask?
Yeah.
Because these people like to do crazy things, you know? They like to put your face everywhere, flip the news on you. Come on, you already know what this is.
You're a counter-protester.
They stood there for over an hour while students were getting assaulted right where we're standing here. And now they come here brandishing zip ties and these guns here.
Do you feel safe?
Not from these cops. They came here to intimidate us.
Students watch from the roof of the English department as history unfolds below. Whatever happens next, These protests, the politics and the policing will be remembered. Martha Kellner, Sky News, Los Angeles.
Well, the campus protest movement began in an encampment at Columbia University in New York last month. But that demonstration has now been brought to a dramatic end with police storming a building which had been occupied, arresting around 300 people. Our US correspondent James Matthews can tell us more.
Ground zero for America's campus unrest. And the drums of protest were still beating at New York's Columbia University.
Hey, Chief. We had a bad night here. We had a bad night at City College. They had a bad night at UCLA.
This was university staff objecting to police, saying they'd patrol campus for the next fortnight. Some students were leaving early for the summer. The university they left behind looked deserted, a tented camp no more, after a hard lesson in public unrest and its policing.
I don't feel safer with a bunch of police on campus like this. Like, I feel intimidated. So I'm moving out because I feel like they want me to be trapped in my dorm room.
I don't know, like I feel like they're being hypocrites when they tell us that we cannot express our right to free speech. We cannot voice that we think what they're doing is wrong. And I just think you cannot flip-flop like that. You cannot tell us one thing, but then only when it suits you.
The NYPD released this video without sound of their overnight operation. Police officers used a vehicle they call the Bear to elevate them to an upper window and inside Hamilton Hall, the academic building occupied by protesters. They removed barricades and demonstrators room by room. Up to 300 people were arrested, and the campus was cleared of demonstrations that triggered similar scenes nationwide.
Free speech is the cornerstone of our society, but as our major concern, we knew and we saw that there were those who were never concerned about free speech. They were concerned about chaos. It was about external actors hijacking peaceful protests and influenced students to escalate.
A mile away from Columbia University, police officers tore down a Palestinian flag at City College, raising the stars and stripes and calling it a proud moment as they restored order. But if campus conflict was stopped here, it was only just starting elsewhere. This was the University of Wisconsin, where police removed a Gaza solidarity camp and made at least a dozen arrests. At Fordham University back in New York, students erected tents inside the building and were warned to leave or face arrest.
I have paid money and now I'm not allowed to use the facilities.
Back at Columbia, it was entry by ID only, following the sharp exits of the night before. The occupation of the university's Hamilton Hall took place 56 years to the day since the same building was taken over by anti-Vietnam War protesters. The traditions of student activism and free speech are issues now as they were then.
All academic year, it's been very skewed that the side that was supporting the Palestinians, supporting human rights, supporting ceasefire, have been frightened to speak because of students have been terrified of being doxxed, which is, being filmed and then putting on websites so that they don't get jobs.
Shame on you! Scenes here and elsewhere compound the difficulties for President Joe Biden. He's already been criticised for the lack of a steady, controlling hand on the Israel-Hamas conflict. Open revolt at university campuses like this one further expose America's angst at events in the Middle East and its interaction with them. And it further tests his leadership. James Matthews, Sky News, at Columbia University in New York.
And James joins us live now from Columbia University. But first, let's go to our US correspondent, Mark Stone, who's at George Washington University in D.C. And Mark, you're deep within that encampment at the moment. And today, Republican lawmakers were as well.
They were, yes. James mentioned President Biden. Well, he is 4 blocks from here at the White House. This is very much the heart of Washington, D.C. and the heart of yet another protest. You can see here many of the protesters are gathering. Just to the left, we've got the barricades that have been put up that were put up, I should say, to try and keep the protesters inside and agitators, as they've become known, outside. Now, over the course of the past week, those barricades have just been piled up in the centre. The real challenge for the authorities here is simply what to do about it. Do they move in, like the police have done in other campuses, or do they stay away? The concern is that to move in, and certainly the Metropolitan Police here in DC were concerned about this last week, if they did move in, that they would exacerbate what they believe here to be a small and relatively isolated and peaceful protest. Now, into that come the politicians, of course. James Comer is the chair of the Oversight Committee, a Republican, a controversial character, many would say. He and some of his colleagues came here in what could only be described as a photo op. But they wanted, they said, to see for themselves what the situation was on the ground. Honestly, they wouldn't have been able to see because the number of media that was surrounding them. But I did catch up with James Comer briefly.
But what about the students' right to protest and their concerns about Gaza?
You have a right to protest. I respect that. We all respect the First Amendment. The problem is you don't have the right to trespass. You don't have the right to intimidate. And that's why we're here today.
You can see the statue here of George Washington has been commandeered by the protesters. He is one of them at the moment. I want to have a chat with one of the protesters who's agreed to talk to us. Miriam, thank you for talking to us. I can see here you've got a sign with the rules and regulations of this protest movement. How long have you been here at this location?
I've been here since Thursday morning. Yeah, we've been here. We're planning to stay until our demands are met. We're demanding that the universities protect pro-Palestinian speech on campus, that they drop all charges against pro-Palestinian student organizers and organizations, that they immediately disclose all investments and endowments, that they divest from the state of Israel, and that they end all academic partnerships with Israel.
How would you characterize the mood of the protest movement here? Because I've been here a few times over the course of the past week. There are a Jewish community who come here from time to time. They claim that you're anti-Semitic. They feel offended.
Yeah, so I can speak to this as a Jew myself, a Jewish student. I think we have seen a lot of baseless claims of anti-Semitism that are meant to distract and divert attention away from the genocide that's been going on for over 200 days, the 76 years of military occupation that we've seen. And, you know, I feel that it's really just a distraction tactic. And I can say that I feel more safe being Jewish inside this encampment than outside, because I know that everyone here believes in collective liberation.
That's interesting. But briefly, do you understand why phrases like "from the river to the sea," like "intifada," like "only one solution," that they are offensive to some Jews?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of discourse about words and speech, but there's not a lot of discourse about genocide. And I would push back and question, you know, if people are more concerned about certain words and certain speech than they are about genocide and the murder of over 35,000 people, then I think they need to have a shift in their priorities.
And lastly, Miriam, very briefly, we've seen what happened in California overnight. We've seen what happened up in New York. Are you concerned that the police might move in here as well?
Yeah, so I think it's shameful what we've been seeing, that police and that universities are, more willing to brutalize their students and put their students in harm's way than they are to divest from genocide. And so, you know, we're going to see what happens here, but we're going to be here until our demands are met, no matter what.
All right, Miriam, thank you very much. A fascinating insight there. I have to say, Yalda, very calm here at the moment.
Mark, thank you so much for all that. Let's bring in James. And James, as you were saying, I mean, Colombia is where all of this really escalated just over a week ago, but a very different scene today.
It is a deserted Columbia University, one of this country's most prestigious schools of learning, Yalda, which has rumbled to the sound of trolleys and students leaving early, actually, at a time in their semester when they're gearing up for the big celebration, particularly those graduating in the year 2024. In the year 2020, they graduated from high school and collected their certificates in a drive-through because, of course, there was COVID. So they miss out. The university misses out from a bustling period of time when students are engaged in what they subscribed and signed up for, essentially freedom of thought, challenging norms. Students are driven towards university and they're encouraged to reach beyond passive acceptance of the world around them. And it's all rooted in freedom of expression without limits, except that there are limits. We have learned that at Columbia and in other places over the course of the past fortnight. And the question that remains unanswered, really, despite staff today protesting against police on campus, students protesting throughout the course of their demonstrations about police presence, the open question without an answer is, how do you encourage freedom of speech without that spilling over into hate? What controls does that need? I think the evidence of our eyes here, Yalda, is that it appears to need a police presence and gates closed, padlocked at an Ivy League school of learning on the east coast of the United States, the famous Columbia University. So it's a scene of extreme dissatisfaction, and it has to be a concern for this place and other schools of learning about how they proceed along along the lines that the guidelines that universities have pursued through time, bringing in students, encouraging, as I say, a freedom of thought that shapes their world and encourages them to shape their world according to their thoughts, their ideas, their freedom to express those ideas. So a dark day for Columbia University, acknowledged by all concerned here.
Yeah, indeed. As you say, a dark day across many of the universities in America. James, Mark, thank you both so much. Well, James there touched on how the unrest has affected students. I'm joined now by Dylan Winwood, a news editor at one of UCLA's student-run newspapers. Thank you so much, Dylan, for joining us here on the programme. Just tell us a little bit more about what's been happening, because you are part of the student paper. Many of your colleagues were actually covering the events that have unfolded overnight.
Yeah, so we actually had a pro-Palestine encampment set up on campus on Thursday morning by student groups, including Students for Justice in Palestine. As a newspaper, we've been covering that around the clock since Thursday. We've seen, starting on Thursday evening, that counter-protesters showed up to make their voice heard, and as evenings have increased since then, that has become increasingly violent. Yesterday evening, we had reporters on the scene when counter-protesters threw fireworks at the encampment. They were also throwing scooters, water bottles, and tear gas as well. So it was an increasingly violent scene on campus overnight.
And some of your friends who were there were directly impacted.
Yeah, so we had a colleague of mine actually had to go to hospital with bruised ribs and also having trouble with their eyesight as well because of tear gas. Another colleague got tear gassed earlier on in the evening, and then on Sunday, a colleague of mine was punched as well. So even as student journalists and even wearing press passes, we've been impacted by the violence on campus.
But Dylan, I'm just going to keep you there because I'd like to bring another guest in who will discuss what's been happening in other campuses in other parts of the world. Really, across the Arab world, demonstrators have also been detained by the authorities. At this protest in Egypt, we can show you those images. 10 people were detained. Just have a look at this. The country has largely banned public protests, and criticism of the country's relationship with Israel is highly sensitive. Well, let's bring in Lubna Darwish, an Egyptian protester who was arrested last week at another Gaza solidarity demonstration in the country. Thank you, Lubna, for joining us. You were just listening to some of the remarks that Dylan was making about how quickly things escalated. And we've seen those images across the United States. But your situation is slightly different there in Egypt. You want to protest. You have staged protests, but they have also been cracked down on.
Yes, it's true. So, of course, the number of protests that we're being able to organize in Egypt in solidarity with Palestine has been more limited than other places where usually freedom of expression and protest was more liberal, I would say. Since October until now, there have been continuous protests every now and then in Egypt, especially in Cairo and Alexandria, big cities. Almost every single one, a large protest was met by a form of arrest or questioning. We were lucky, actually, in the protest, which was a women protest. It was a feminist protest in front of the building of UN Women, the regional office of UN Women in Cairo. We were lucky that actually, after arrest, people were within 48 hours released, pending investigation, facing charges of terrorism and assembly with aim to destroy public and private property, which did not happen both. We were, regardless of this, and we're still facing charges, we were very lucky. It was 16 people, not 10. Because since October until now,
I'm just going to interrupt you there, because the Egyptian government has made its position very clear on how they feel about the war in Gaza. I've interviewed the Egyptian foreign minister, who's condemned the situation in Gaza and condemned the way in which Israel has handled this war, and yet they're cracking down on protests. Why?
Because first of all, it's sometimes the Egyptian people, some groups of within Egypt have different demands and more ambitious demands from the Egyptian government when it comes to the situation in Gaza and Palestine in general. But also, it's one thing to have, a public, formal position, and it's a very sensitive issue for the Egyptian government for people to actually express themselves, especially that protests and solidarity with Palestine has been historically an important step in political expression and political organizing in the country to the point where it actually starts to deal with other issues than Palestine itself. But the most important is that you're allowed to express your opinion within the context of agreeing totally with the government or simply saying, yes, I support the government's position, but you can't even take the streets. Taking the streets, organizing, all this is criminalized, has been criminalized for 10 years now.
Yeah, and I just want you to react to what we saw in the United States, the crackdown that we've been seeing, the confrontation by the police against the student protesters.
I think on one level, I'm totally with the protesters when they say we should always focus. The focus should be only on Gaza, so the focus should be only on Palestine. But what's happening with police brutality against protesters and arresting of protesters and allowing civilian groups to attack protesters on campuses actually has been not only harming those students on campuses and actually freedom of speech in the US, for example, but normalizing an attack on freedom of expression and protest all over the world. In countries like the US, in Germany, what's been happening when it comes to freedom of speech in the last 8 months has been setting an example and normalizing the kind of, attack on dissent that's happening in different places around the world, and even giving governments that have been doing it for years another pretext, another reason to say, oh, but even the US and Germany are doing it, therefore nobody should question attack on protests.
Yeah,
for me,
I'm just gonna...
I feel, yes.
Sorry, I have 30 seconds left, so I just want to go to Dylan and get your response to what you're hearing Lubna say there, that the crackdown that, the world is seeing on these student protesters, universities like yourself. She fears that the various different regimes and authorities in the Middle East will use that also against them.
Yeah, it's very hard for us to say what impact what's happening at UCLA will have in the wider world. We know that there haven't been a significant number of arrests yet at UCLA, but that the Chancellor of the university did declare the encampment as an unlawful assembly yesterday. So we're keeping our eyes on what's going to happen next with regards to the policing response.
Okay, Dylan, Lubna, I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. So protests on university campuses and others quickly subdued in the region. Coming up, we'll talk about another crackdown. These pictures that you're seeing are from Georgia, where opposition leaders will say a new law will limit media freedom. I'll be speaking to the country's president, who said she'll veto it. And we report from the Erez crossing as Israel finally opens its southern border to allow aid into Gaza.
I'm Mark Stone and I'm Sky's correspondent based here in Washington, D.C.
Our street!
Well, the plan seems to be to head to the police station where the policeman who fired the shots was based.
And everything, you know, his memories is all gone.
I've witnessed the remarkable passion for politics here, but the anger too.
We have to get Trump out of the White House.
I'm playing devil's advocate.
You've got your political agenda.
No, it's honestly,
God love you.
And beyond the United States, I report from around the world. This is a town that is effectively encircled by the Russians. We take you to the heart of stories that shape our planet.
Akbar!
I can hear now quite a few explosions in the distance here in Jerusalem. What do you think of ISIS?
Everybody here, they know the truth of ISIS.
Welcome back. After weeks of aid agencies warning of an imminent famine in Gaza, Israel has finally opened the area's crossing to allow aid trucks into the north. The US had issued an ultimatum after a deadly attack on aid workers in Gaza a month ago, saying its continued support for the war would depend on more aid being allowed in. The crossing on the northern edge of Gaza was previously used by people crossing the border on foot. It's been closed since it was damaged during Hamas's attack on October the 7th. Our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey was there as the first aid trucks were allowed in.
Once considered impregnable, the battered watchtowers, damaged buildings and the workers repairing the Erez crossing between Israel and Gaza, a testament to the fact that Hamas overran this place on October the 7th last year, something most people considered impossible. This is the first time we've been allowed here since that day, a day that signalled Israel's previously presumed unassailable security system had in fact completely failed. Israelis haven't got over it. Now, though, past new security fences and through old security walls, aid trucks from Jordan are being allowed to cross into Gaza. This is the first time it's happened through Erez. And it's happened because of international pressure led by the United States for Israel to do more. The humanitarian cargo is unloaded in this part of Gaza and will be collected by aid agencies in their own trucks and taken further into northern Gaza, where it's desperately needed. The coordination of the movement of the aid inside is the most dangerous bit for the agencies. Last month, 7 workers from the World Central Kitchen NGO were killed, despite their mission being coordinated with the Israeli Defense Forces.
Some of those coordinated humanitarian movements have ended up with aid workers dead. I'm thinking of Central Kitchen, for example. What guarantees can you give to the international community that once the aid gets dropped there, the aid workers themselves won't be targeted again?
We've coordinated thousands of movements from the beginning of the war.
There are dozens of movements every day. Even though that I'm very sorry about what happened with WCK, it's the only occasion that we had such a very sorry event. And we are doing everything that we can in order to prevent it. There were lessons that we've learned from what happened in WCK, and those lessons were implemented.
Israeli soldiers guarding the aid drop-off point stare out at the ruins of Gaza. The Erez crossing has divided these peoples. Now it's a lifeline demanded by the international community.
One mustn't underestimate the significance of the Erez crossing being taken by Hamas on October the 7th. I've crossed through here many, many times. I would have considered it impossible. It seemed like an impregnable fortress. Well, the wall has been opened up now by the Israeli government to let aid come through. And the simple reason for that is the amount of international pressure that's growing upon the Israelis to allow more aid to get into Gaza.
Thank you, Blinken. Thank you, Blinken.
United States Secretary of State Antony Blinken, on his 7th visit to the region, had an impromptu meeting with families of hostages still in Gaza. He's come to urge an agreement on a ceasefire in Gaza and ensure the delivery of aid to the Strip dramatically increases.
The progress is real, but given the need, given the immense need in Gaza, it needs to be accelerated, it needs to be sustained.
Children crowd around the site of one of the latest deadly airstrikes on the city of Rafah. With all the talk of a ground offensive, it's easy to forget that the city is bombed virtually every day, killing many. Such is the fear that Israel is about to attack that some are leaving. This is Khan Yunis, destroyed in this war. It says all you need to know about fear, that people are prepared to live here, in the midst of this rubble, rather than risk being in Rafah when the Israeli army attacks. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Israel.
This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, the Ozempic craze. What is the drug? How does it work? Plus, why is it gaining momentum among celebrities and criticism from medical professionals? A lot of questions. Stay tuned to find out. Welcome back. Last July, the UK declared a shortage of the diabetes drug Ozempic after a surge in demand for its weight loss properties. Its popularity grew after celebrities far and wide revealed they had used it to dramatic effect. But what exactly does Ozempic do? And is it all it's hyped up to be? Here's everything you need to know. Ozempic is the branded name for the drug semaglutide. It's been used for years as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. But one unintended side effect is weight loss. Since then, companies have used higher doses of the drug to make products like Ozempic, Wegovy, and most recently, Mounjaro. And it's a big deal. More than 9 million people use Ozempic across America, and huge numbers have reported successful weight loss results. So is Ozempic really a miracle drug for losing weight? It's prescribed as an injection to be taken weekly, making people feel full by suppressing their appetite.
It's a drug used to treat type 2 diabetes. It helps regulate blood sugar levels by imitating a hormone called glucagon-like peptide 1 that we naturally produce in our guts.
It's also taken the celebrity world by storm. Oprah Winfrey, Amy Schumer, and Jeremy Clarkson all say they've taken Ozempic. The list also includes Elon Musk and even former Prime Minister Boris Johnson. And it's become a talking point for millions on social media. The Danish is worth more than $500 billion. That's bigger than the entire GDP of Denmark. So just how far could weight loss drugs go? Despite Ozempic becoming a household name, in the UK and the US, it's not licensed as a weight loss treatment. Mounjaro, a similar drug, is far easier to get hold of in parts of the world where Ozempic isn't. It's now being used in the UK for weight loss. But they all have their critics. Most recently, doctors have reported a rise in what they've called Ozempic babies. Hundreds of women on birth control have unexpectedly become pregnant while being prescribed semaglutide. Many have taken to TikTok. Novo Nordisk says it doesn't recommend the drug for women who are pregnant or people who are trying to get pregnant in the next 2 months. With demand for the drug rising, how will brands like Ozempic be best known? As the type 2 diabetes treatment or the viral weight loss solution? So one woman who takes the drug Mounjaro is the Real Housewives of New Jersey star, Dolores Catania, who joins me now. Thank you so much, Dolores, for joining us on the program. So you're currently on Mounjaro, but you've also taken Ozempic.
Well, I started with Ozempic. Well, I actually started with metformin, which is prescribed for pre-diabetic insulin resistant. And that was great. And then the doctor had said, you could try Ozempic, which is a lot easier. It's 1 shot a week rather than 4 big pills a day. And I didn't realize that that was what was keeping my weight down, to be honest. And because of the cost, I just stopped taking it. I wasn't compliant. My insurance didn't cover Ozempic. So I stopped taking it. And then I realized I gained so much weight. And then the Ozempic started coming out on weight loss. And I was like, it clicked with me. I'm like, I think that's what I'm supposed to be on. And I went back on to taking it and lost 30 pounds. So now I'm on Mounjaro, which is for the weight loss. And I really love it, I have to say. I feel great. I feel healthy. I've looked into it. I have no problems with it.
So just to be clear, you started off using Ozempic. It was prescribed to you by your doctor because you were pre-diabetic. And then you shifted and now you use it as a weight loss drug, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. So of course it does work with my health concerns with my pre-diabetes, but it also my weight down and makes me feel great. And the biggest thing is, I've lost my craving for sweets and I've lost the will to want to overeat. And that's the main thing. I think when you take it for weight loss, you go up in dosage, right? So that's where my weight started to fall off. And right now I'm on the 15 milligrams, which is the highest dose. Now that I've reached my weight loss, I'll cut back on it and it'll just be like a maintenance period.
And did you have sort of side effects as you started to take it? I know you're also taking it for health reasons, but just in terms of the weight loss and the fact that you are on the highest dose, did it have any real side effects for you?
The only side effect I did have was nausea. If I ate something sweet, it kind of makes you really nauseous. So they give you Zofran for that. They prescribe a medication for the nausea as well, which helps. And that did essentially go away. I mean, it did go away.
Yeah, I mean, you, again, you're pre-diabetic, so there's also a reason why you're taking it. But what about your friends and people you're mixing with? Are they getting sort of drawn to this this pill or drug because they're seeing the results?
Absolutely. It's a shot once a week, and they've all seen the results on each other. It cannot be denied that it has been a great weight loss tool. There's no, I want to say there's no magic drug for anything, but this certainly works. And it's also helped me realize how much I was overeating. So yes, if I see someone skinny, I know I'm going to say I believe they are doing this. Semaglutide, Mounjaro, tirzepatide. It's pretty much all the same drug under different names, I think, now.
Dolores, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, listening to all that was NHS surgeon Dr. Karen Rajan. Thank you very much, Doctor, for joining us here on the program. I mean, just listening there to Dolores. She, of course, is pre-diabetic, so it was prescribed to her by her doctor. But she talks about her friends taking this as well, simply for weight loss. Just your reaction.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to her personal experience. I think, every patient is the master of their own experience. And I think our role as doctors is just to provide evidence and information for people to make their own autonomous choice. I would just caution that people taking potent medication like this just for weight loss purposes, that's not for medical reasons, that's not prescribed or looked over by a doctor, comes with risks. Any medical intervention has risks, whether you're taking antibiotics or you're taking weight loss injections. And I think for someone of a normal weight taking a potent medication, the risk versus benefit ratio doesn't add up always.
Just talk us through the potential risks.
So, as Dolores mentioned, that you've got, standard risks that are, probably higher in frequency, and then the more rarer, serious ones. So common ones that you may encounter, things like nausea, vomiting, indigestion type symptoms, maybe diarrhea. And I think some of the more serious symptoms and side effects, and I've seen a couple of those, things like pancreatitis, which is an inflammation of the pancreas. And I've seen a patient admitted to hospital with a pancreatitis secondary to Ozempic. Now, it's not very common, but it has been reported in the literature, and it has been reported in the clinical setting as well by doctors. So I think that has to be taken into account when someone who doesn't require it for prolonging their life or prolonging their quality of life. If someone is just taking it to have a quick weight loss or get a six-pack before their wedding or photo shoot, that's not the right reasons to be taking a medication like this.
Dr. Karen Rajan, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you very much.
This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, violent protests in Georgia against the so-called Foreign Agents Bill. I'll be speaking to the Georgian president, who said she'll veto it.
We're in a boat in the middle of the ocean, and if stuff goes wrong, we have to get ourselves out of it. Plastic was created as this amazing material that would last forever, and we've done that.
Every inch of this ocean has a plastic fragment.
The problem is totally different than what I expected.
I've never seen so much rubbish in the middle of nowhere.
You on shark watch?
We left from Hawaii and we sailed across the middle of the North Pacific Gyre, or what we know as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, to Vancouver. So 3,000 miles across the Pacific, doing scientific experiments along the way to really find out more about how much is in the ocean, what it's like, the fact that it breaks down into these small fragments that we call microplastics, and to really look at the chemistry of the plastic, the things adhering to it, to ultimately find out how we can solve it. It's all to do with the currents. So we have a huge, great big circulating current in each of our oceans. And in the centre, there's a calm patch. And so that's where all the plastic accumulates. So we had to sail straight on into those really strong winds to be able to get to the centre of the gyre. I think the biggest thing, we often expect to find an island of plastic. But the most surprising thing is that the wind and the waves and the sun break it down into fragments. So this is one of our samples here that we collected, and we actually found 507 pieces, which equates to over 500,000 in 1 square kilometre. The fact that it's this big, and now the estimates are looking at around 171 trillion pieces in our ocean, the idea of trying to go out there into this very challenging environment and clean it up just seems like the most enormous task, and that we really need to work at the source to stop it getting in there in the first place.
And so the documentary is coming out imminently, and you hope that the conclusion of it is eliminating single-use plastics at source?
Yeah, what the documentary really does is it takes people on this journey with us. It's quite an extraordinary place to visit. Not many people have been there. And so it allows you to really see firsthand, you know, what we saw, what the true problem is of plastic.
The leaders of the main opposition party in Georgia was pushed into parliament in a wheelchair today with his swollen face in bandages. It comes as dozens of people were arrested by police in the capital Tbilisi, who also used tear gas and water cannon. Our Moscow correspondent Ivo Bennett can tell us what's been going on.
The protesters say they were peaceful. The response certainly was not. Physical attacks by Georgia's security forces, just one part of last night's violent crackdown. Water cannon, tear gas and stun grenades were also used to target the thousands who had gathered in Tbilisi. Standing one's ground, not an option.
This is completely illegal what they are doing. People has peaceful protests and you see that they are behaving illegally.
They were demonstrating against the so-called Foreign Agents Bill being debated in Parliament. They believe it's authoritarian and smacks of Russian influence. The UK, the US and the EU all agree. Similar to legislation in Russia, organisations with more than 20% funding from abroad would have to register as foreign agents. Supporters say it'll protect Georgian sovereignty, but critics fear it'll stifle dissent.
We had it in Hungary, passed by Orban, that caused the elimination of the civil society, shutting down the NGOs, free media. Lots of people from those organizations simply left the country, and now Russia is basically free from most of the NGOs or opposition-minded groups exactly because of this law.
Opposition figures say they were targeted and have the photos to prove it. Levan Khabashvili is leader of the main opposition party. Today, despite his injuries, he was speaking in Parliament where the debate continued. But even in here, the mood did not remain calm. The proposed bill has left Georgia deeply divided, and with more debates to come, the protests will continue. Ivo Bennett, Sky News, Moscow.
Well, I'm joined now by the Georgian President, Saloma Zurabishvili. Thank you very much, President, for joining us here on the programme. It's horrific to see these images of the violence used against the protesters, especially against some of these opposition figures.
Yeah, against some of the opposition figures, against the youth, but that is not what will deter the Georgian population. It's a long fight that Georgia has until now won many times against Russian domination. And what is important in the introduction of this bill is the fact that it's purely Russian-inspired law. And that is what has raised all these protests among what is very important, that it is not directed by the opposition parties that have lost much of their influence, but it's directed by the civil society, by the young part of the population that doesn't want to fall back under the Russian influence. They have seen with the candidate status that was granted to Georgia in December and the promise of opening of negotiations of adhesion to the European Union by the end of the year, presumably, they see that this is a reality that is at hand, and they're not going to give to anyone the possibility to steal this perspective, this reality from them.
And yet, this bill is likely to go ahead. That's despite your attempts, and you say that you will veto it.
Yeah, the veto is more of a symbol today, as I put the veto on all the laws, so it's not the only one that this ruling party, this government has passed, that go against the spirit and the letter of the recommendations that the European Union has presented for granting Georgia the next stage, which is opening of negotiations. So what is at hand is not this law. This law is a symbol. What is at hand is the decision, the choice, the existential choice that Georgia will have to make by the time of the elections of Europe or Russia. And what is very preoccupying and what is not acceptable by the entire Georgian population is what has been said by the honorary president of the Georgian Dream, the ruling party, Mr. Ivanishvili, 2 days ago, which is declaring that the West, that the European Union, our partners, our enemies, our agents, are trying to foment a revolution in Georgia. That is exactly...
And President, you say that the Georgian people have this choice when the elections happen, but just tell us about the impact of this bill. What sort of impact will it have on Georgia as a whole?
It will not have an impact on Georgia as a whole, because again, the issue that is at stake is much larger than this bill, which will be adopted probably in a month or months and a half time, and I will veto and that will delay again. Again, the main issue is what will happen at the elections. It's next October, and there's a whole number of bills that have been taken that are less prominent than this one, which has focused the interest of the population, which all show that the ruling party is trying to push Georgia towards Russia.
Yes.
And that's something that the Georgian population, the very vast majority, 80%, for 30 years have been saying that no, we want you.
Unfortunately, President, we've run out of time, but you've made it very clear that the choice is clear between Europe and the West and Russia for Georgia at the next election. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, that's it for tonight's show. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll have much more again tomorrow, but the news at 10 is next. Good night.